Hello, my name is Crystal Petry, and you are watching another episode of the Crystal Petry Podcast, Season 4. History isn't just what's written, it's what's remembered, preserved, and told with intention. Today, we're diving into the powerful legacy of the Negro Motorist Green Book and how it guided Black travelers through a segregated America. Joined by Gretchen Sorin, we explore how museums play a critical role in telling the full and often untold story of African American experiences. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Gretchen Sorin.
Thank
How
you
are
so
you?
much. Thank you, Crystal. It's great to be here.
I am so happy you agreed to be on the podcast. I am honored to have you on here, Professor. So
Thank you.
tell us, where in the world are you?
So I'm in Cooperstown, New York. I am the director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program, which is a museum studies training program.
Excellent, excellent. So let's hop into these questions, Professor. For those unfamiliar, and maybe people have seen the movie because the movie came out about it several years ago. But for those that are unfamiliar, what was the Green Book and why was it created?
So the Negro Motorist Green Book was a travel guide for African Americans who traveled in Jim Crow America. And it listed places that you could stay, places that you would be welcome. And it was really an essential piece of equipment if you were traveling in the United States. As more and more African Americans took to the road in their cars, and they also took trains and buses, they wanted to travel across the country, but they were traversing white spaces that were dangerous.
Mhm.
And the guide was really to help them stay safe.
Talk to us a little bit more about this, Professor. Just the fact, and of course, I was not alive during that time. I cannot imagine having to, check a book before I can travel anywhere for safety reasons. So, talk to us a little more about what that mindset must have been like, the feelings of having to look in a book and say, I can go to this hotel and stay safely. I could bring my family to this gas station and get gas safely.
Um, it's interesting. I think I was a child, a young child during the early part of this, and I can remember my parents always charted out a trip. If we were taking a trip, and we went every summer to visit my grandmother in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I'm a Great Migration baby, and so they would plan. They would plan the travel. We would start out really, really early in the morning, maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning when it was still dark. And it always seemed to me that was um, just what you did. You started out in the dark. And as I was doing this research, I found out that many African Americans like to drive in the dark because it was harder to identify who was driving then, and you were less likely to be stopped by the police. So you would start out in the dark, and then you would drive. And when we went to Fayetteville, North Carolina from Newark, New Jersey, where I grew up, my father just drove straight through. We never stopped. We carried all of our food in the car. And I think people always kind of planned out their trips,
Mhm.
tried to drive in the dark when they could, carried their food with them in the car, carried sometimes a large coffee can, which was used as a pea can, and really rarely stopped. The Negro Motorist Green Book and other travel guides, because there were many, many other travel guides, made it possible for people to stop overnight if they wanted to. You could find motels, you could find hotels that would be welcoming. And you can imagine how difficult it would be if you were a parent and you were stopping somewhere to try and get a meal, or you're stopping somewhere to try and get a hotel room and you were denied, or your family was humiliated because somebody treated you badly, and you certainly didn't want that to happen to your children. You didn't
Mhm.
want your children to see that, and so people use these travel guides to make sure that they were stopping at places that were safe for their families and that were welcoming.
How widespread was the use of the Negro Motorist Green Book? Was it just in the South? Was it where in the United States was it all used?
Well, Victor Green is from Harlem. He had a bad experience. He and his wife Alma had a bad experience when they were traveling, and so they were the ones that really conceptualized the Negro Motorist Green Book. But he was not the first, and he wouldn't be the last. So they started it in New York, and the very first Green Books are just the New York, Connecticut, New Jersey metropolitan area. And then he very gradually moves out across the rest of the country, excuse me, out across the rest of the country, and then to Europe as well, and to Africa. So ultimately, before the Green Book ends, he's basically talking about the world. It was not used just in the South. And in fact, my mother didn't know anything about it. I was very curious about it, but I think you didn't have to have the Negro Motorist Green Book. There were other travel guides, and also if you went into the backs of newspapers and magazines, there were advertisements there as well. So the Amsterdam News, the Baltimore Afro American, these newspapers advertised hotels and motels, restaurants, resorts, places to stop and stay. So you could get that information even if you didn't have the Negro Motorist Green Book.
What spaces or what companies rather were within the Green Book and the other travel guides? I mean, the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head, Professor, is like motels, maybe restaurants, gas stations.
Absolutely. Hotels and motels. There were tourist homes and guest houses that you might go and visit for a week. There were beauty parlors. There were places that you could get your car fixed, right? So if you're traveling along the road and you get a flat tire or you need some oil for your car, there were nightclubs. There were roadhouses. So there were all kinds of establishments that you might find along the road. And the different kinds of travel guides. There were different travel guides. So for example, there was a travel guide that was very popular with show people, because who was doing a lot of traveling, people that were performers, and those travel guides often had drugstores, dentists, doctors, beauty parlors, places that show people might need in an emergency situation if they were traveling. So I think the depending on the audience for the travel guide, they had different kinds of establishments.
How did the Green Book and other travel guides for African Americans reflect the realities of segregation in America? Because most people think it was just in the South, and it was very heavy in the South, but it was also, very heavy in the East Coast and, Chicago and different places like that as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that in the South, you were likely to find the signs, the Jim Crow signs, said
Mhm.
no colored, no Negroes, whatever. In the North, in the West, it was more by custom. You were just supposed to know that you were not welcome in certain places, in certain restaurants, in certain hotels. And that actually made it more difficult to know where you could stop and where you couldn't stop. So that's where the Green Book comes in really handy. Um, Most of the places that you could stop were in Black neighborhoods. So you had to go and find the Black neighborhood.
Mhm.
But there were usually um, places of different qualities, right? There were fancy hotels, and there were small tourist homes, basically early bed and breakfasts
Yes.
um, were kind of included. Most of the early Green Books will say something like Mrs. Jones' home.
Mhm.
So anybody that had an extra room or two in their house could make it available in the Green Book, and then you could stop there and have a meal and spend the night. And it was also a way for women to make some extra money, by having just a spare room and renting it out to people who were traveling.
Professor, as you're talking about the spaces and the communities that were formed with this Green Book, I cannot possibly comprehend people allowing strangers to just come into their home for their own safety and for their own protection. It's amazing to me. And it also makes me wonder, when did we get away from that?
That's a very interesting question that I haven't nobody's ever asked me that before. It used to be that if African American families were traveling and you didn't know where to stay, you didn't have a place to stay, you didn't have the Green Book, you might stop at a Black church and ask the pastor if he could put you up, or if he could tell you one of the church women that could put you up. So there was kind of this community feeling,
Yes,
that was within the African American community during the period of segregation, that is so interesting to me, because we all know that segregation was about keeping Black people down, but Black people made the most of it by finding ways of protecting one another and caring for one another and supporting one another. And it's about resilience. It's about making a way out of no way, as they say. It really was a fascinating period, I think.
yes.
But you're right. You wouldn't do that today. You wouldn't offer a stranger to come into your house and spend the night.
Right. Even for their own safety, you wouldn't do it. We wouldn't do it. I just feel like we've just been conditioned not to trust. And,
right.
We're in 2026. I feel like we've been conditioned. So how long was the Green Book and other travel books like this in circulation, and when did it stop, and why did it stop?
The very earliest Green Book is probably in the early 20th century. But the Negro Motorist Green Book starts in 1936 and it ends in 1966 with the civil rights legislation that's passed in the early 1960s makes segregation illegal. Mm-hmm. And there are a variety of lawsuits. There's a lawsuit against Hilton. There are lawsuits against Howard Johnson's, and these lawsuits, people look at these hotels and they say, we're gonna force these hotels open, and they do. And Black people, because they can go and stay now at the Hilton, they do, because they've worked so hard to break them open. And what happens is that small mom and pop businesses, tourist homes and guest houses, they lose a lot of business as these large hotels open up. What's also lost is kind of the character of these places, because these small mom and pop businesses had a lot of character. They were very individual. And if you stay at Hilton or you stay at Howard Johnson's or at the Ramada Inn, a room in Newark, New Jersey is exactly the same as a room in Los Angeles or a room in Chicago. They are cookie cutter. They don't have that kind of character, and that's something that's lost. But I don't think we can't romanticize the end of Jim Crow, because it was a not a good thing. Segregation was not a good thing. Mm-hmm. But what does happen is that we lose a lot of African American businesses.
Yes.
And the reason we lose them is not that every Black person stopped frequenting these businesses. It's that white people did not pick up and use the Black businesses in any large numbers.
Mm-hmm. What would you say? And you said it ended about 1966. And as you were talking, Professor, I was thinking, even though, the legislation was passed, the lawsuits were, enacted and won, but the safety was not there for
Right.
African Americans travel. Like, you were still unsafe going to these gas stations and restaurants and hotels, even though there's legislation that has been passed. So
It,
I feel
you're right.
like the Green Book probably should have continued to be in circulation, if not just for the safety alone.
No, you're right. You're right. It didn't automatically desegregate most places. And there was nothing that stopped a hotel from saying, oh, we just rented our last room. How would you know?
Right.
Right. So we do know that there are examples of people being denied um, the right to stay at a hotel or a motel or eat at a restaurant after the civil rights legislation is passed.
Yes.
Very gradually, the country does begin to open up. But interestingly, the Negro Motorist Green Book becomes a model for other communities. So the gay community, for example, they begin to put out a Green Book style guide that provides places that are safe for you to travel if you're gay. I think, and in recent years there has been a renewal of interest in putting out a Green Book, places that African Americans will feel more comfortable, more welcome, and safer. So that interest is continuing. Sadly, I would say.
I did not know that the gay community created their own travel book.
Yes.
Wow. I did not know that, but I'm not surprised, because African Americans are always leading change, whether it's the travel book, staying in different hotels, restaurants, and then other communities are able to benefit from the charge that we took as African Americans. What would you say, and I think you spoke to it a little bit, what would you say is the lasting impact of the Green Book in America, even today?
I would say it really helps us to remember a really difficult and sad period in American history. But also, right now we're in a period of backsliding.
Mhm.
We're in a period where we have forgotten how hard people worked to end segregation, how hard people worked to get voting rights. And it's really important that we remember this history so that we don't slide back. So African Americans have been responsible for expanding freedom in this country over the course of our history. Right, we have expanded freedom. Part of expanding that freedom is ending segregation. Was ending
Mhm.
segregation. Part of expanding that freedom was getting voting rights for everyone. As we kind of slide back into we're sliding back into segregation. There are parts of this country that are very segregated.
Yes.
There are communities that are very segregated. As we slide back into denial of voting for people, as we slide back into segregation, I think it's important to remember this history.
I am going to amen you on that, Professor, and say not only is it important that we remember this history, but it's also important that different communities that have benefited from the challenge, the death, the lives of
Mhm.
African Americans for
Know about it.
segregation, those communities need to remember it as well.
Absolutely.
And
They
be
need to learn about it. They need to learn
and
about
need
it.
to learn about
Yes.
it and be aware of the reason I can go into this hotel is because of African Americans. The reason I can go into different colleges is because of African Americans. So yes, we all need to remember that, but communities need to remember that and learn about it
Absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely. And I would add that In the 20th century, African Americans are moving into the middle class, right?
Yes.
They're moving up, they're moving into the middle class. And a lot of historians will say, well, when African Americans move into the middle class, they buy into the whole American scene, and they don't do anything. They're not activists. And I argue that African Americans, just by going out on the road and traveling, by taking their families on vacation, by going to beaches, by going to hotels and restaurants, they were being activists.
Yes.
They were pushing the limits, and they were saying, we have to do this. This is our right as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally disagree that the Black middle class was not doing anything, was not doing enough. I think they were very consciously, but perhaps very quietly, they're taking their kids out on the road in their automobiles, and they're traveling across this country, and they're forcing the country to open up.
So, Professor, what drew you personally to study and write about the topic of the Green Book and other travel guides for African Americans in a segregated America?
I was working on an exhibition on the history of African Americans in Saratoga Springs, New York, which is a horse racing community.
Okay.
And a colleague of mine, who was also an African American historian, handed me the cover of a Green Book and said, "Have you ever seen this before?" And I had not seen it. And I was just curious about it. I thought, what is this thing? And this was probably 25 years ago. And I just started doing research on it to try and figure out, what is this thing, this Negro Motorist Green Book? And that's really where it started. And that led me to the automobile and the role that the automobile played in African American life. And I realized that no one had written a book about the role that the automobile played in African American life. There are lots of books about cars. People love cars, and they write about cars. But for African Americans, the automobile was different. The automobile proved to be a way of freeing them from the bonds of their communities. It let African Americans go out and explore without having to get on a segregated bus and without having to get in a segregated train car. You had your own transportation. You did not have to worry about some bus driver telling you to go to sit in the back of the bus. You could decide where you were going, when you were going, and you didn't have to face that humiliation. And so I wanted to, as I researched the Green Book and found out more about the automobile and thought more about the automobile, I wanted to write a book that really addressed African Americans and the automobile and the role that it played, because the car is so essential to this. And that's where my book, Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights, that's where it comes from. It comes from that interest in learning more about African Americans and the automobile.
Wow. I know a little bit about this subject, but you are right, it's not widely discussed or taught about. But I will ask my listeners and my viewers to look up how African Americans saved Cadillac, because Cadillac was going out of business, and if not for African Americans, we probably would not have that car company today. So,
and Cadillac did not want Black people to drive their cars.
They did not.
However, the reason that African Americans could buy expensive cars was because they were denied mortgages.
Yes.
You could not get a bank mortgage, and therefore you put your money into the next largest purchase that a family makes, and that's your car. Mm-hmm. And so you had African Americans that had these expensive Buicks, and they had expensive Cadillacs, and they had all these expensive cars because they couldn't get a mortgage,
right,
for a house, to buy a house. And so that's one of the reasons you see people with Cadillacs, even though Black people got incredible criticism. Even, if you read the autobiography of Sammy Davis Jr. or the autobiography of Mahalia Jackson, they're making apologies for owning Cadillacs.
Wow.
and it's like, wait, they could afford a Cadillac. Why couldn't they afford? I mean, they were stars, they were stars. Uh, but they're apologizing because people are criticizing them. Chuck Berry had a Cadillac, a pink Cadillac. It's now
Yes.
Smithsonian. Yes, they could certainly afford these cars, and that was important to Black people to have a nice car,
Hmm.
especially when you couldn't have a nice house. You couldn't buy a house.
Correct. Correct. So again, research African Americans and Cadillacs. It is an amazing, amazing story how we saved that car company. What would you say, Professor, surprised you the most about your research?
Well, I guess there's one thing that really surprised me, and that was, people talk about Victor Green all the time. Victor Green dies in 1960, and his wife, Alma, completely takes over the company, the publishing company, and she runs it until 1966.
Okay, who is Victor Green?
Victor Green is the founder of the Negro Motorist Green Book.
Okay. Okay.
And his wife, Alma, never gets any credit for managing this company, but she takes over in 1959, probably, when he gets sick. I don't know exactly what happens to him, but he dies in 1960, and she takes over. And there are 4 women that work with her, 1 white woman and 3 Black women. And these 5 women together run this publishing company until 1966, and nobody gives them credit. This was a time period when women did not run publishing.
Correct.
And there were Black women managing and putting out the Negro Motorist Green Book every year, and they still said it was being done by Victor Green. And it was all of these women.
Even after he passed away, he was still getting credit for the book.
He was still getting credit for it. It was still talking about Victor Green. And most of the people that write about it write about Victor Green. They don't write about Alma. But Alma and these women were running this company.
Wow. How would you say, Professor, your work and your research has changed the way people understand this time? Or do you think it has changed the way people understand that time period?
I think it's changed the way people think about the automobile.
Okay.
I have done a lot of talking about cars and the role that the automobile played in African American life. And I think people are surprised by that. And I think it really has changed the way they think about it. I hope that people think about Alma Green and think about the fact that this was a woman-owned company for quite a few years. And I hope that it really has helped people to have a deeper understanding of the relationship between African Americans, their automobiles, and their travel, and the changes that are happening in that time period with the Black middle class.
Why do you think this information is still relevant today? Why is it still needed today? Because I'm sure you have heard, and I have heard, and so many people have heard, that was in the past. Let it go. Why do you keep bringing it up? What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I say everything that happened in the past, we're building on that, right? Everything that has happened before has created the present. There's not a way that we can get away with that. It really helps us to understand policing. I mean, if I can go off on a little bit of a tangent, police forces in this country started as slave catchers.
Yes.
And it helps us to understand the relationship between police and African Americans today, to look at this history, and also to think about how we can change that. How can we change that relationship to be a much better and safer relationship for African Americans? So, I think everything that's happened in the past informs the present, and it informs the future. Where are we going? Who are we as Americans? And where are we headed? Are we headed toward a more equitable world, or are we headed toward a less equitable world? are we living up to the promises of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in this 250th anniversary? Are we living up to those promises? And I think these stories help us to think about where we're not doing very well and what we can do to change things.
Let's talk about the role that museums play in telling history. Why do you think that some, of course not all, that some museums are so hesitant to tell the full story of American history with the racism, Jim Crow, slavery included, because that's a major part of American history as well?
I think they're afraid. I think there are museums, especially now in the climate in which we're living now. I think there are some museums that are really afraid to tell those stories, that they're afraid that they will lose funding. They're afraid that they'll be criticized. The slavery really, enslaved people really built this country, and really, slavery constituted a huge part of the colonial economy, enormous part of it. So I think you really can't tell the American story. The African American story is the American story, and you really can't tell the history without it. I will tell you, last summer I had the opportunity to go to the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, and they have the Rosa Parks bus. And you can get on it and sit down.
What?
And I will tell you that is just a powerful experience. It's powerful.
Wow.
And I think that's one of the reasons that museums are such powerful places. It's real. It's tangible. And the good thing that I saw happening there, people loved getting on that bus. White people as well as Black people were getting on that bus and sitting in the seat where Rosa Parks sat.
Oh my goodness.
And also the seat that Obama had gone to the museum
He
and
did.
sat in that seat. And I've got photographs of my granddaughters, sitting on the Rosa Parks bus. It was a powerful experience. They also have the Jenkins minibus. It's a museum of transportation. That's one of their focuses because it's the Ford Museum. And the Jenkins minibus was a bus that a man used to bring people from one of the sea islands over the bridge to bring his children to school because there was no high school on the island. Excuse me. And he also used that bus to teach people what they needed to do to pass the test in order to vote in Georgia. And he also used that bus to train people in how to vote. And, it was so powerful. I've been reading a book about the various methods of protest. And then to see that bus, to see that vehicle, that tangible bit of history it's incredible. It's so meaningful to actually see it.
Yes. I remember I went to a museum in Washington, D.C. The name escaped me. It was years ago, but they were showing and talking about the original American flag that Betsy Ross, I don't know if she sewed it or designed it, or maybe both, but it said in the fine print, American flag sewn by her servants. So yes, we all know during that time, there were no servants.
Right.
It was her slave female.
Yes.
And so it says female servant in the little, fine print. And this was maybe 10 years ago.
To make
so,
again, not so bad. It's to make people feel not so bad. They don't want to feel badly about having families having owned people.
Right.
And so they are, making up
and
stories.
The acknowledgement that an African-American woman sewed the first American flag.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
Yes. So, yeah. It just goes back to these museums not telling the full story of the American history. Do you feel like museums have evolved, or some
Oh,
museums
absolutely.
have evolved in telling the
Absolutely. Yeah.
complete African American history?
I think museums have, I think there are a lot of museums out there that are working very hard to tell that story.
Hmm.
And also, there are more people of color working in museums who are telling those stories.
Yes.
As I said, the Henry Ford, uh, not only do they have the Rosa Parks bus and the Jenkins minibus, but they have just acquired the the house that Martin Luther King stayed in when he and I'm not sure exactly what city, if the house is from Selma or if it's from Montgomery, but they've acquired the house and they're adding it to their outdoor buildings. Um, they're working hard to tell these stories, and I think there are a lot of museums that are doing that. Are there some that are falling down on the job? Yes, yes, there are. But hopefully, as others, um, step up. Whitney Plantation, I think, is a good example. Whitney Plantation is in Louisiana, and it is a plantation house, a Southern plantation house, dedicated entirely to talking about the enslaved people that lived there. They
Right.
don't talk about the white family. They talk about the the people that the large number of people that lived there who were enslaved.
And if I'm not correct on this, please correct me, Professor, but the Whitney House at one point in time, people would have weddings and different things like
Yes,
that at
yes,
this plantation house, and they would stay there. And then I'm not sure what caused the pivot. I'm glad that the pivot happened, but I do know for years and years, mostly white families would go and have their weddings there and spend a night there. And it was considered something great and admirable to do.
well, I think that was happening at a lot of Southern plantation homes,
Yes.
and I know that based on protests, places like the Knot, the Knot, which is it's a website that you use when you're planning your wedding. The Knot will not
Wow.
take plantations anymore, plantation
Wow.
sites
Amazing.
as venues anymore. So there are a lot of plantations that, I mean, I'm sure there are still some that are doing it, but there are plantations that have said we will not do weddings because this was not a happy place. This is a forced labor camp.
Yes.
Plantations were a forced labor camp, and it's not, it's not right to do um, a wedding there.
Right. And kudos to the Whitney plantation, the owners, whoever are over that are starting to, go back to our original conversation of telling the entire American history of what happened here in this plantation so that people can go and learn and be educated about that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so as we're getting ready to wrap up, Professor, what museums are, what responsibility, I will say, what responsibilities do you think museums have to future generations?
I think our responsibility working in museums is to make sure that they're not just places of entertainment, but they're places where you can learn about yourself. You can learn about who you are.
Hmm.
You should be able to see yourself in a museum, and you should be able to learn about the past in ways that they should tell us about how we have done well and
Hmm.
how we have done not so well. But they should be places that help us to realize how we can do better,
Yes.
and how we can make this country better. And I think that really is an important role that museums play, and that we should be able to go to a museum. These are the places that after you've gone to college, after you've had your education, these are places, the education of the general public, right?
Hmm.
These are the places that we go to learn about what's going on in the world. And they should help us to understand our world, our country, who we are, and they should help us to make ourselves better. And I think that's the role we have to play.
Professor Sorin, as a collegiate graduate professor, how can educators incorporate the lessons and the history of the Negro Motorist Green Book into their curriculum?
Well, one of the things that I think that I found that's really popular with everybody is this notion of getting in a car and going someplace. People really, really like to talk about going on vacation or going someplace in a car, even if it's an Uber or just getting in a car and going, and that feeling of being whisked away from one place to another. So I always encourage teachers to talk to students about what do you have to do? How do you prepare when you're going on a trip? What do you have to take with you? And then to think about what does it mean not to have mobility, not to be able to travel. That's one of the things that is not in the Constitution, but is in the Articles of Confederation, is the importance of mobility, the importance of being able to go where you want to go, when you want to go. That is the essence of a free society, that you can go where you want to go, when you want to go. And the essence of a society that is not free is when you are restrained from movement, from mobility. So I encourage teachers to think about the role that mobility plays in a free society. And who has freedom of mobility? Who doesn't? When did certain people not have freedom of mobility? And what does that mean for a society that professes to be a free society?
And let's talk about the younger generation. During our conversation, Professor, we've talked about the onus that museums have and the onus that the country has to continue to tell the story, the entire American story, including the African American story, the slavery, the racism. What responsibility, what onus does the younger generation have in this?
I think it has to be part of the curriculum. It has to be part of what every child in the United States learns in school. And we can't learn the lessons that a lot of textbooks, teach you South was bad, North was good. Well, that's
Yes.
not true.
Not at all.
That is not true. I think as we're learning about the way the country operates, we learn about the checks and balances, we learn about the Constitution. Included in that has to be a discussion of American history that includes enslavement, and that includes the fact that the issue of slavery was not settled in the 18th century. That's why we had the Civil War, that the Civil War was all about slavery. That needs to be included. And then it helps us to understand where we are now. What we're fighting about. We're fighting now about Confederate monuments. We're fighting about, those. It helps us to understand, well, why are people still interested in these Confederate monuments? What is it about these Confederate monuments that
they want to hold on to?
They want to hold on to. Exactly.
Yes. Now, my final question for you, Professor, if listeners can take away, and you've dropped so many amazing gems, may I say, during this conversation, but if listeners can take away one message from this conversation, or maybe something that we did not have the pleasure of discussing, what would that be?
I think that we need to be, every American needs to be an American activist. I think we all need to be constantly vigilant and aware of what's going on in the world and in the country. And I think we need to be making sure, as our ancestors, the people that came before us, and you mentioned this, those people that came before that made it possible for us to have this conversation, for us to be middle class, for us to be able to vote. There are so many people that made it possible. The Victor Green in his Green Book. There are so many people that made our lives better because of the suffering that they endured. Now, what are we going to do? How are we going to maintain that? And how are we going to move forward?
I love that call to action. And that's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Professor, for being on my podcast. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Good to talk to you.
And to my community, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You can get Professor Sorin's podcast and all of my other podcasts on YouTube Podcasts as well as Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.